Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
We've all felt the lure of the short, sweet read. One of those slim books you can finish in a few hours, maybe even over a hot cup of tea. But what about the books that may take weeks, even months to read? The doorstoppers, the heavyweights, the long reads. Think Dickens, Tolstoy and George Eliot, Hilary Mantel, David Foster Wallace, Donna Tartt.
In recent months, we've taken on the challenge of the long read, diving into classic work The Magic Mountain by German author Thomas Mann. It's almost 700 pages long, probably more depending on your edition, and set over the course of 7 years. Arguably, it feels like it takes just as long to read. In this episode, we report back on the experience, joined by journalist and friend of the pod, Philip Chafee, and Toby Brothers of the London Literary Salon. What did we think of The Magic Mountain? Was it worth the effort? And how do we feel about long reads in general? What are the pleasures and perils that come with a book that takes weeks, even months, to read?
We'll also be offering up our own recommendations for the best of the big books. If you're going to commit to a long read, which one should it be? Keep listening to find out.
And so, without further ado, before this turns into the longest podcast introduction, let's get to it. Toby, Phil, it is so lovely to have you both here with us in the shed, and we've got Laura here on screen, dialing in from Vancouver. The London Literary Salon is all about guiding readers through the classic works of literature, and listeners, do check out episode 31 after this for our extended interview with Toby. Toby, tell me, what have you been reading recently?
Well, let's see. At the moment, I'm doing a whole lot of Proust. I'm now on my 6th voyage through Search of Lost Time with a very wonderfully keen group. There's an interesting trend during the pandemic that a lot of people are interested in reading Proust. I'm also doing a Finnegan's Wake study. We actually made it all the way through the wake, and the group decided now they want to read it again so they can know kind of what's going on. I'm also doing 3 studies of Ulysses, 2 for new readers, 1 for Ulysses rebounders, as well as Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and, The Whale. We're doing Moby Dick.
Well, so listeners, now you know why Toby is here. She is the go-to for long books.
And Phil, you're here because we love you so, but also because I remember quite keenly debating with you at book club once whether or not 600 pages counted as a long read. You were quite firm that 600 pages was not a long read. What is the longest book that you've read recently?
Probably there was a Magic Mountain, but obviously that, and then A Little Life I just read as well for a contemporary doorstop,
the
Hanya, Yanigahara. And I would qualify those both as long reads. I think sort of 600 plus seems long read to me. But obviously page length is sort of arbitrary given that the print can be dramatically different.
There's long reads and long reads, isn't there?
Well, it's so lovely to have you both back on the pod. Now, Kate picked The Magic Mountain. I was not involved in this decision. Kate, what made you want to read The Magic Mountain? Why this one?
Well, I actually acquired my copy of The Magic Mountain when I met Toby, when I went to interview her about the literary salon. And this was the book that you were going through with a group, and I sat in on this session. And as a result, I got a copy and I read a bit of it. And I was kind of loving it, but I put it aside. This was 2 years ago, 3 years ago now. And I haven't picked it up again. So then when it came to thinking about long reads, I sort of felt like I had unfinished business with Thomas Mann. But also because there's a new book out by Colm Tóibín called The Magician, which is a novel about Mann and his life, which I have a copy of. I've heard great things. I really want to read it. But I wanted to read some Mann first. So it just sort of seemed like the right time to read Thomas Mann.
Well, what's it all about? The Magic Mountain was published in 1924, and it tells the story of Hans Castorp, a young German man from a well-to-do family. He was orphaned at a young age and brought up by his uncle. He's recently finished his education. He's soon going to be starting a career as an engineer. But first, when we meet him, despite his own good health, he's actually set off for a 3-week stay at a Swiss sanatorium, where his cousin, Joachim, is currently staying in the hopes of a cure for his tuberculosis.
The visit's only meant to be 3 weeks, but quite quickly doubts arise about Hans's own health, and he too becomes a patient at the sanatorium. And then I'll turn to the blurb on the back of the book, which puts it quite succinctly. Hans falls in love and becomes intoxicated with the ideas he hears at the clinic, ideas which will strain and crack apart a world on the verge of the First World War. I did just want to read the foreword, which is only a couple of pages, and I think sets the scene very nicely. It's Thomas Mann's foreword. He says, "The story of Hans Castorp, which we would here set forth, not on his own account, for in him the reader will make acquaintance with a simple-minded though pleasing young man, but for the sake of the story itself, which seems to us highly worth telling, though it must needs be borne in mind in Hans Castorp's behalf that it is his story, and not every story happens to everybody. This story, we say, belongs to the long ago, is already, so to speak, covered with historic mould, and unquestionably to be presented in the tense best suited to a narrative out of the depth of the past. That should be no drawback to a story, but rather the reverse. Since histories must be in the past, then the more past the better, it would seem, for them in their character as histories, and for him, the teller of them, rounding wizard of times gone by. With this story, moreover, it stands as it does today with human beings, not least among them writers of tales. It is far older than its years. Its age may not be measured by length of days, nor the weight of time on its head reckoned by the rising or setting of suns. In a word, the degree of its antiquity has nowadays to do with the passage of time, in which statement the author intentionally touches upon the strange and questionable double nature of that riddling element. But we would not wilfully obscure a plain matter. The exaggerated pastness of our narrative is due to its taking place before the epoch when a certain crisis shattered its way through life and consciousness and left a deep chasm behind. It takes place, or rather deliberately to avoid the present tense, it took place and had taken place, in the long ago, in the old days, the days of the world before the Great War, in the beginning of which so much began that has scarcely yet left off beginning. Yes, it took place before that, yet not so long before. Is not the pastness of the past the profounder, the completer, the more legendary, the more immediately before the present it falls? More than that, our story has, of its own nature, something of the legend about it now and again. We shall tell it at length, thoroughly, in detail. For when did a narrative seem too long or too short by reason of the actual time or space it took up? We do not fear being called meticulous, inclining as we do to the view that only the exhaustive can be truly interesting. Not all in a minute, then, will the narrator be finished with the story of our hands. The 7 days of a week will not suffice. No, nor 7 months either. Best not too soon to make too plain how much mortal time must pass over his head while he sits spun round in his spell. Heaven forbid it should be 7 years. And now we begin. Only the exhaustive can be interesting. I remember when I first read that, and I sent that to you in a text, Bill.
Kate, I just had the very disorienting experience of hearing you read prose that was completely different to the prose that I was reading, because my translation is by John E. Woods, and your translation must be by someone else entirely.
Oh, how interesting. So I remember when we did War and Peace with Book Group, and we had various different translations going. And for the first time in my life, I became genuinely fascinated by the nuances of different translations. Because when you read a book like that, it really matters.
Absolutely.
But we get sidetracked. I was going to ask Phil how he got on with the exhaustive Magic Mountain.
Very well. I've had this superpower since lockdowns began, basically, and I switched to audiobooks, and I started taking very long daily walks. And I feel like I can just plow through massive books, which used to fell me. And the Magic Mountain I actually tried when I was 22. I just graduated, and I made it about 100 pages and realized absolutely nothing was happening and gave it up. But being able to plow through it, I picked up so much more, and it was much more pleasurable. I just read through it or listened through it in about 10 days.
Wow.
Wow.
I can't imagine.
At what speed? 1.5?
A bit fast. But also some very long walks.
I mean, I think I looked up the audiobook briefly earlier, and I think it's 37 hours.
Yes.
Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was not listening for 37 hours, because I did listen a bit fast.
One of the themes that keeps recurring throughout the book is time, and Mann actively draws your attention to how slowly things are proceeding at various points. And there isn't much action. You know, Hans is up in the sanatorium, up in the Swiss Alps. It's very regimented. They do certain things at the same time every day. The only real excitement that ever happens is a meal, and then they go back and they lie on their balconies in the freezing air. And
6 meals, actually.
It's the horizontal, isn't it? Yeah. It's part of this cure that they're all up for. And I did feel that there were moments when he was almost daring me to give up, slightly goading me. What do you think, Toby? What are the strategies for getting through it? Because there's definitely a point where I remember I had been reading fairly consistently for what felt to me like quite a long time. And I was only about 150 pages in. And I really just thought, wow, this is, am I going to make it through this? And there's not a lot of action to keep you invested, to keep you turning the pages.
I think he does something very tricky, Mann, the writer. He gives action later in the text. So by the time you get to about 2/3 in, all of a sudden things are happening quickly. But yes, he's testing your mettle. But I also think with these big reads, the book has to train you. It has to train you how to think differently. And it's interesting, I'm listening to you both talk about time, and we're in this really strange moment, right? We've all become very aware that time doesn't move in predictable ways, that we have this sort of mythology of being able to measure time, upon which we base a great deal of our human enterprise. But what we've learned in the last couple of years is time actually behaves in very strange ways.
Mm.
When you read Mann, when you read Proust, when you read these big books, they are asking you to step into a very different worldview from which you can look back on your own experience and things will startle you that you've always known, but you didn't know. So that's part of what the length is about.
Mm.
Now, you asked specifically for strategies, and I was listening to what Phil was saying, and I never thought of listening to the audio at a doubled speed, but what a great idea. And in some ways, it's about, yes, getting through the pages, getting yourself so that you've gotten far enough that you're not going to turn back. So I think using the technologies that we have available, such as audiobook, is brilliant. But I also think giving yourself reasonable but slightly challenging sections to get through. So okay, per week, how much do I need to get through to have this book read in 12 weeks? And then really hitting those targets. And if you don't, speed it up a little bit, listen to the audiobook. I do think audiobooks are a great way to get more of the text in your head. I encourage people that are doing the studies with me to use the audiobook alongside of the text. But let's be honest, time is tight, and we get into these places where we get a little squeezed. It's not cheating, right?
Absolutely. And in some ways, it sometimes feels that you can have a much richer experience listening to a book, listening to someone really good reading. It depends very much on who's doing it, but the right person with the right book can really come alive in a way that it's not the same as the experience when you're reading it to yourself. So interesting, that idea about training you up. That really resonates with me now, that idea. Because I think, yes, I think that's what happened, because you have to be sort of ready for the end, which I did not see coming because I'm an idiot. Because Mann told me, he told all of you just now in the introduction, pretty much what's going to happen at the end. He also told you how long the book's going to take you to read, told you how long the passage of time in the book is going to unfold over. And yet, despite all these clues, I was probably, 9/10 of the way through it. I remember saying to my husband, I just don't know where he's going with all of this. I really didn't see it going. So then when I got to the end, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone, it was a really extraordinary experience for me reading this book. And I think that ending really, just took my breath away.
I think that these huge texts also get us to perhaps reconsider why it is that we read. So we talk about plot.
I definitely wondered at points during this, why am I reading this?
Right. And what about the repetitive nature?
Yes.
And it's so fascinating to me to think about Magic Mountain in terms of what we've just been through. I wonder, and it's just a question, if people would say, even though their lives hit a kind of repetitive rhythm, if there wasn't some value that they found even in that repetitive rhythm. Because what we are forced to realize is that instead of doing, we think. And to observe the mind at work is part of what these great works are asking us to do. It questions the traditional idea of plot. Since, the Odyssey and the Iliad, we have thought that narrative was based on events, The modernists come along and say, narrative fiction is an opportunity to examine the mind at work. And that's not always about what happens, but that's also how we are trained as readers to move through a text. So just for example, with Magic Mountain, one of the things that Mann gets us to think about is the experience of illness and how we use illness as a space from which to study our bodies. And he does all of these really crazy, interesting examinations of, why we take our temperatures and what we do with an X-ray and what does the X-ray show. But slowly you might get the idea or the epiphany that we examine the body's function from the place of illness, not from health. And how strange that is.
Yes, and Hans Castorp, who I think of as our hero, because that's how Mann refers to him throughout the text, he has to come to terms with this idea. First of all, he's just sort of fascinated, almost slightly creepily fascinated, I felt, with the idea of death and suffering. And he's very youthful and vigorous, and there is some suspicion that he's got a high temperature and that there's something wrong with him. But I don't think I ever really felt he was ill in the same way that the other people in the sanatorium are ill. And his observation of them is just, I found it a little creepy. I mean, one of the challenges for me with this book was that I didn't find Hans Castorp a particularly sympathetic main character. I didn't really like him very much. Phil, did you care about him?
No, I thought he was a complete cipher. But I think that was intentional. I think he was meant to be just sort of coming in and representing the blank slate of modern man. And But yeah, did he have any particular qualities? I guess he would sort of bumble a lot and cut in with sort of long, pointless anecdotes into conversations. I was just trying to think of a characteristic of Hans Castorp.
It would be hard, wouldn't it? It'd be hard to say. If someone said, "Oh, Hans, tell me, what's he like?" You'd be like, "Well,
he's curious."
He's
definitely
and he's open, isn't he? And so then another challenging element of this novel is that he is this blank canvas, and then he has these two teachers, doesn't he, that he meets up there. So there's Settembrini, who is a rather attractive character. He's an Italian. He doesn't have much money. He's very sort of threadbare, but he's a great philosopher and he's a humanist. He represents this one particular school of thought. And then there's Naphtha, who is a Jesuit priest who is up there in the mountains as well, also suffering from this illness, who represents a different view. I have to say and confess, perhaps, that I did allow my eyes to slide over the pages. I imagine in your salons you make people go through these with much care and attention.
I love this. In the salon, we have to go
it was tough.
It. Yeah,
they were tough. It was tough.
And I think it's when it resonates at least a little bit with what we understand. One of the ways to see it is Mann is using Settembrini and Naphtha to give us a sense of the tensions that are building before World War I, and the different ways, of course, that people approach the world.
I was reading his afterword, which is this lovely lecture that he clearly gave on the Magic Mountain, because he eventually went to America, didn't he? And the Magic Mountain was very successful there. And there's this lecture in my edition that he gave talking about it, and he says, if you have enjoyed this book of mine, I recommend you read it twice. And you're like, what? I just finished it. Come on. But I can see he persuades me, because I can see it's that classic thing. Once you're not just thinking about the plot, then you're open to all of the different... There is such a kind of interweaving tapestry of ideas in this that I found completely entrancing. I loved it.
Can I interject?
Laura, I haven't been going to you, but only because listeners won't know. But from the WhatsApp chat, my suspicion was that you hadn't made it very far through. How did you get on?
Well, I have only made it to 150 pages. I have a small child. I don't get to do much reading. The reading that I do happens usually after 9 p.m, and this is not a book to keep you awake. If I had some long hours, mid-afternoon cup of tea, yes, I could definitely see myself sinking in. But what I wanted to interject on was kind of a question to Toby, really, about the length. Toby, I hear you when you're talking about the modernists, departing from plot and saying maybe plot isn't really what we're looking at here. At the same time, Mann saying, yes, you should read my book twice, to me just slightly speaks to the male ego. And I think of Woolf, Virginia Woolf, who writes perfect slivers of modernist novels that you could reread and reread again, and there would always be something more. But they're short. They're short. That feels quite different to Mann, to other male modernists. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's a great point. And I'm a huge, huge Virginia Woolf fan. And I did just do a study of The Years, which is her big doorstopper, right? That's a big book. I think you're right. And let's be clear, it's not just the volume and the thickness of it that should make a book valuable. I think that Mann and Proust and Joyce all are trying to walk into a universe that's different from the way that people have used language, have used story, have used character. And therefore, can I say this? The length is justified. So this is my theory. The length is justified because it takes the reader time to get used to the experimentation and then to be able to do the work of understanding what it is that I'm asked to overturn in my comprehension of human experience. And that does take some time. But I'm totally an apologist for these writers.
No,
but it's...
And to be clear, you don't have to persuade me. I completely understand that experience. And I think what you must offer people at the London Literary Salon is just that chance to go a little bit deeper because of the discussion and the rigor of the reading that you're asking of people. I had wanted to ask about length too, because I was thinking about the 19th century novelists. The length of those books, of Dickens, for example, that was really because of the format, right? The serialized format. Whereas here, there's a different something going on, isn't there?
Well, and Dickens was being paid by the word. So yeah, he was going to write a lot. But, and it's immersion, right? It's an immersion in a universe and a life. Proust, for example, the reason the length is we walk with the narrator over the course of his life so that when the writer steps in and is making references to a memory, we have that received memory as part of our experience. So it's this totality that these writers are offering as a place of study, of a deeper understanding of how we encounter each other, of how we encounter the world.
I think this book, The Magic Mountain, is such an interesting example of a long read because it's a long read that feels like a long read. It's a long read that, clearly he intentionally meant to feel like a long read. He wants you to feel bored, I think, because you're up there in the sanatorium with Hans and nothing is happening. But if you compare it to, say, War and Peace, which is longer, significantly longer. But I always say this to people who haven't read War and Peace. You fly through War and Peace. It's nothing but action and characters. It's like a soap opera. It just goes from one thing to another. In The Magic Mountain, nothing much happens for a really long time. And I actually felt institutionalized in a way. I became a bit addicted to this slightly hypnotic quality of this writing and this atmosphere that he conjures up so effectively. And I didn't want to leave. I actually think I could read it twice. I can imagine reading it again. I can.
That's it.
I did struggle a bit, particularly in the Nafta Settembrini. There's long chapters of just them arguing. But as I was reading it, I was also fascinated, and I was reading everything I could about Mann. And there was this amazing Alex Ross article in the New Yorker a month ago on January 24th.
Oh, I love him.
Which has some amazing details about this. But one of these is that he started writing this in 1912 when his wife Katya went up to visit a similar place, sanatorium. He went and visited her just like Hans visits his cousin. And then he envisioned this as he had just published the novella Death in Venice, and he envisioned this as a novella. And then he spent 12 more years writing this. And in the course of that 12 years, you had World War I, and then you had the Weimar Republic. And if you think of this as a Weimar novel, when everything has fallen apart, civilization has almost destroyed itself, and now you have everyone, sort of class is demolished, you have everyone out in the street, communists and fascists, everyone going at it. And this is him working through all of that and working through this enormous upheaval and this civilizational almost destruction. He himself swaying back and forth politically, and it's just so fascinating then when you give it that context, and it felt much more exciting.
That's hugely important. Mann, as he's writing it, goes through an extraordinary political shift and uses the novel, and this is one of the great examples of art getting to track a process. I mean, Mann was the ultimate German champion of nationality, of kind of a brawny, fighting, heroic German stance from a great culture. And then he changed because of world events, and that change is clocked over the course of Magic Mountain. And just thinking about the Settembrini Nafta, I mean, I think that we don't say this, but we should say this, that not every part of every book is going to appeal to every reader every time they read it, right? Now, I think it's important to read through because you get this very powerful philosophical engagement, and some of it will sink in, and you're actually learning a great deal there. And when you do the second read, it's going to make a lot more sense, and also leaning on the resources that are out there. I mean, there's a reason people are writing about Thomas Mann. You know, we've kind of lived through this slowed down, reduced event time.
Yeah, it's funny, I hadn't made that connection, but of course you're right. As soon as you said it, I said, yes, it's like lockdown.
You guys have made it sound as if it is quite a heavy read, and in many ways it is a heavy read, but it is, at least my translation, is quite funny. Is that like there's a lot of dry, odd humor coming through?
I think that's there. I see that. I think dry is the right word. There's a wry quality. It's got that classic thing where the narrator, every so often, he draws your attention to him and his take on things. And that's always quite funny when that happens.
I think I would not read any big work if it didn't have a comic element.
Yeah.
I want to briefly read, it's just part of one paragraph. It's not a whole paragraph. And this is an example of that wry quality. For a person to be disposed to more significant deeds that go beyond what is simply required of him, even when his own times may provide no satisfactory answer to the question of why, he needs either a rare, heroic personality that exists in a kind of moral isolation and immediacy, or one characterized by exceptionally robust vitality. Neither the former nor the latter was the case with Hans Castorp. And so he probably was mediocre after all, though in a very honorable sense of the word.
Aww.
You know, and it's very funny.
Yeah.
And Mann is saying, this is not the heroic character, so what's going to be the use of our spending 864 pages with?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to show you.
Well, that's what I mean, I think, about him sort of almost daring you to give up, because I'm like, yes, I'm wondering that myself, Thomas.
And I was just thinking about Ulysses, which of course is the doorstopper and very daunting and intimidating and hysterical and incredibly vital, sexy book. I hope I've gotten somebody to pick it up and read it. It is all one day. It's famously one day in the life of a unremarkable advertising canvasser. And why? Why does Joyce do this huge text for one day? Well, because every day that we go through is epic. Where we go in our minds, what we do, the different struggles that we encounter, the different stress, all of that would make a 900-page book of any given day of our lives. That's my argument for big books. Although, yeah, I like Virginia Woolf.
Well, I feel that brings us on to the question, is it worth it? Is it worth eschewing, I don't know how many books I could have read. In fact, I did read actually several other books on the side while I was reading this in the early days before I really committed to it. But yeah, I mean, I probably could have got through 12 other books in the time that I read this one book. And there's that little sense of, having to put aside those experiences and stick with this. But was it worth it? What do you think, Phil? Was it worth it?
Yes, I think it was very much worth it. I encourage you to finish it, Laura. A lot of it has sat with me. I do imagine I will return to it, particularly his passages about time. They really hit home. I was speaking with one of my friends. This is his favorite book. And he says he'll periodically just pick it up for the blizzard scene. Which is absolutely gorgeous.
I'm just looking now. I want to, because he takes up skiing.
Yeah.
And that is relatively dynamic. And I actually was in the mountains in Switzerland. I took this with me. I had a feeling it would come into its own there, and it did. And yeah, this is brilliant, this bit where he takes up skiing. He rejoiced in his new resource, before which all difficulties and hindrances to movement fell away. It gave him the utter solitude he craved, and filled his soul with impressions of the wild inhumanity, the precariousness of this region into which he had ventured. On his one hand, he might have a precipitous, pine-clad declivity falling away into the mists. On the other, sheer rock might rise with masses of snow in monstrous cyclopean forms, all domed and vaulted, swelling or cavernous. He would halt for a moment to quench the sound of his own movement, when the silence about him would be absolute, complete, a wadded soundlessness, as it were, elsewhere all unknown. There was no stir of air, not so much as might even lightly sway the tree boughs. There was not a rustle, nor the voice of a bird. It was primeval silence to which Hans Castorp hearkened, when he leaned thus on his staff, his head on one side, his mouth open. And always it snowed without pause, endlessly, gently, soundlessly falling. And you get to a passage like that and you're like, oh, this is why I'm reading this book. For me, the effect of it was very much cumulative. I felt you have to go through every word on every page to get the payoff at the end, which is, I can't even put into words how I felt about it. I felt enriched by it. I felt like my mind had expanded from reading it, that I was thinking slightly differently. And I just thought that's why it can be worth it. For the right book, a long book, will take you on this journey, and you're going to be in this other place with this other mind for enough time. It's going to change you. Will it last? I don't know. I finished it fairly recently. It's all quite fresh. It's still with me. But I feel the experience of reading it. And it's completely unique as well. Like nothing else is like this. I wonder again, I think that's something to do with the fact that it's so long. It allows you to develop these ideas and this theme and to really take you somewhere in a way that a shorter book perhaps just couldn't do.
We talk about length, but there's also the idea of the density and density of thought in writing. So actually, turning back to Virginia Woolf, the texture of her writing is so dense that her shorter books actually are, to me, long books, if you will. But what you just said, Kate, I think is so right on. The lived experience of a big work that requires you as a reader to commit time, to commit thought over an extended period of time. Of course, that's going to rest in you and shift your thinking and move into your mind in a more profound way. And I'm also thinking, I mean, to go all metaphorical, that if you're trying to do a 20-stop tour of China, after the first 3 or 4 stops, you're going to think, you know what? I would get so much more out of this if I spent the rest of the holiday in one place and really got to know it. And that's where you go.
That's very much the Magic Mountain, isn't it? You're very much in one place. Yeah.
And I wanted to add, as someone who is still only 150 pages in, that I am fully persuaded by the impact that a long read can have. I'm very conscious, because Kate and I are both on Instagram. We're bookstagrammers. And so there is this bad habit, I think, that we've formed, that many readers have formed, of feeling like reading a book in and of itself is an accomplishment, and you need to get on to the next one, and you need to document it, and it's a checklist, and off you go. As if reading a book, any book, in itself is worthwhile. And so this invitation with the Magic Mountain to linger, to slow down, just to be, to spend time in this world is very enticing.
Beautifully said.
I too, as listeners know, I too have young children, and I did think at many points, I just felt like this is not the book to be read, because you're just constantly being interrupted. And it's really frustrating being interrupted when you're trying to read Thomas Mann. But yeah, so I think this one was worth it. But, you know, if our listeners are now thinking, yes, I want to commit to some really serious reading time, I want to read a long book, what are the other books that we think that they should read? What are your recommendations? Toby, should we start with you? I feel like I'm sure you're going to have some.
That's like, it's a killer question for
I mean,
me,
should we start with Proust? Because I feel like Proust is a really obvious one. I once started Proust and was actually quite enjoying it, but much like the Man, I put it to one side and haven't picked it up again.
Well, and this is where a book club or a friend group or community group is so important because it's hard to have the stamina on your own. But if you know that every couple of weeks you're going to be gathering and you need to be able to speak with some knowledge about what you've read, I think that really helps. I think these big books need support. Proust is 7 volumes. It's 2,000 pages. And I fought reading Proust. I did not come to Proust happily. I had a wonderful group of salonistas who had read everything else I had to offer, and they said, now come on, we got to do Proust, right? We've done Mann, we've done Joyce, we've done Woolf, we've done Faulkner, Ralph Ellison, Proust. Okay. I was not enamored, to be honest, just between us and your listeners, for the first 2.5 volumes. And then I got it.
Huh.
And then I got it. I started to understand what the writer was up to. And there's romance, and there's cattiness, and there's flawed romances, and there's food, and you've got Belle Époque France. And so it's kind of delicious. And every once in a while, he throws you a gorgeous lyric description of the way a light falls through a window. And suddenly you're back in. So Proust for me is a great example of a work that you must commit yourself to and kind of keep recommitting yourself to, and that pays off enormously. Proust has taught me patience and taught me to attend to the world of sensory experience in a way that I never did. So there are gifts. Those are gifts. Other great big books. I mean, we haven't talked about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, but for me, that's one of these books.
When you say The Invisible Man, I think of I'm thinking of the H.G. Wells.
Not that
this is
one.
something different.
Yes.
I've never heard of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. What is that?
We gotta read that.
It's American, right?
Yeah.
It's American. It's often argued for as the great American novel, but of course everybody loves to have that argument. Why do we need a great American novel anyway? Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is about a young black man in segregation era Harlem. It's like these other works, a coming to an awareness of self and moving through the world's attempt to give him an identity. He's invisible because white America doesn't see him, and therefore he has to push against that invisibility to know who he is. It's also an extraordinary historic text. It's also jazzy, at points hallucinatory. It's a great encapsulation of racial history in the United States. It's an extraordinary read, but you have to steel yourself. There are times where it's quite violent. It can push you away because you're interacting with a narrator who you feel like doesn't do anything. He just lets the world happen to him. Well, that's part of that experience as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking about Marlon James's book, A Brief History of Seven Killings, which is long, very long. It's amazing. I really enjoyed it when we did it for my book club, but I remember it was a really good book club book. There was a lot of debate about it. It was quite divisive. And there were some things that people didn't feel worked so well. And I do remember thinking, I don't think this should have been this long. I don't think it needed to be this long. And what's so interesting about The Man is that I wouldn't lose a page. It felt like that was just the right length. Anyway, sorry to keep going about The Man.
but that's an extraordinary thing to be able to say about this huge novel, right? Is it that ultimately it was valuable.
Yeah.
I think there's a very tricky relationship that a reader has with a fabled great work, because you come into it and you think, wait, I'm not getting it, or I'm not overwhelmed by it, or it feels too long, or I'm bored. And then you start to either question the value of the work or your own understanding. And I think that that's a really hard dynamic. You have to do some work to get the value.
Phil, how about you? What's a long read that you love?
A long read that I love. I mean, Invisible Man is one of my favorite books.
Is it?
That is a great answer, and you should definitely
How
read
can
it.
I never? I'm really embarrassed.
I mean,
I'm
I
so
think
sorry.
I had to read it in high school, so it was like a
it's really
life-changing
not
book then.
on
And
in the
it's-
kind of canon here. We don't.
It's on the American canon.
Yeah.
I don't think it is here.
Oh well, I'm happy to have found out about it.
Another one I read at the same time as that, I was 18, 19, was The Brothers Karamazov, the Dostoyevsky. I have not read it cover to cover since, but I've dipped in and out. It is like the 19th century novels, around a skeleton of a pulpy plot. There's like a murder. It's unclear who did it, but murder of the father of the brothers Karamazov. But it is not about the plot, and it's just astonishing, some of the flights that Dostoyevsky goes into.
These are all male writers, and I feel like it's very easy to think of big doorsteps by male writers. But what about Middlemarch?
Love Middlemarch.
That's one of those books where I read it probably when I was like 19 or something, feeling like I needed to read, great classic. Probably didn't get half of it. I reread it a couple of years ago, I think, and I was just blown away by how good it is.
Yes.
I would say when I finished it, I felt like that wasn't really, as you said, Hans Castorp is a cipher. He's not really trying to bring these characters to life. But I just thought, wow, I would have loved this even more if these characters have really lived and breathed for me, which they don't really in The Mann. You feel like that's not really what's going on. Whereas George Eliot's characters, they are right there. You know, you're with them, you're in their minds, you're in their hearts. And it's just this story of provincial life, isn't it? Two couples, one who makes the right choice, one who makes the wrong choice. Well, actually, no, the main
make
two
the wrong choice.
Yeah, both make the wrong choice for different reasons. And then there's another couple who, underneath, just ticking away very quietly, at the end, you suddenly realise, no, they're the ones who got it right. And famously, our heroine, Dorothea, chooses Korzebon for his intellect and his mind. And she has these lofty ideas about attaching herself to this man. And I remember when I read it as a 19-year-old, I was like, what are you doing? This is crazy. Why would you want to be with him? Weirdly, reading it as a 45-year-old, I was so sympathetic to Korzebon. Really? I was really like, poor man.
Well, he says he has the key to all mythologies. I mean, that's sexy, right? That's even though he's described as a skull over and over, so you know that she's not making a great choice. But you understand. And this is the thing that, you're right, the modernist doesn't feel the responsibility to the reader of making the character fully fleshed human beings. They're often doing something different with the movement and the interactions and the trajectory of the characters. I love Middlemarch, and I do think that it's an interesting thing for us to notice that so many of the big books are by people of the male gender, and I wonder what that's about. I have some guesses about the anxiety of being an author, the struggle to get the attention, and therefore the need to be accessible, pithy.
I was thinking I won't be able to talk about it very fluently because I haven't finished it, but I've been reading the new Olga Tocarczuk.
The Books of Jacob.
Books of Jacob. So I started it before The Mann and then I had to put it to one side. That's 900 pages. Normally with a long book, I divide it up into sections, as you suggested earlier, I think. And then I just have a little sense of, oh, today I'll read, this, and just helps you keep the momentum going, I suppose. So I blithely picked up the Tocarczuk, the Gilwood, and I discovered that the page numbers go backwards. So even just dividing it up into 50-page sections is challenging. It's long, it's incredibly complex. It's set in the 18th century. We're in a village in Poland, and the borders are incredibly porous, so that there is a lot of traffic between countries and people of different nationalities and languages all coming and going. And there's this Jewish community there, and it's focused around them, and it flits between one character and another's point of view, never really resting on anyone for very long. So I don't have a sense of there being like a main character as such yet. But what I love, and I think she does so beautifully, is that every character feels alive to me, and I'm there with their thoughts and their feelings. She really manages to do that, and you feel she as an author is really invested in that, as well as telling this story. I'm not quite sure where it's going. It seems to be something to do with these religious texts, and also even with my, as Phil knows, he's looking at me slightly despairingly, incredibly hazy knowledge of history. I know that things do not go well for the Jews, and I feel like things are probably going to go downhill. But yeah, and I'm not finding it hard to read. Again, even though there's no obvious narrative hook pulling me through, it's more a sense of atmosphere and a pleasure in being in these words and this writer's mind that keeps you going.
And there's something, even for very big, pulpy long novels, there's just something about the length of just immersing yourself in a milieu and a place or whatever, that even if for some of those pulpier ones they could be cut down, part of the appeal is you're just going to get lost in this place for a couple months.
Yeah. And one thing I think I should own is that I don't know a great deal of contemporary literature. So I think that there are longer works being written by women. And I'm also thinking about Dorothy Richardson. She wrote something that very few people have heard of. She was one of the writers that is called the inventor of stream of consciousness. And she, I think a 4 or 5 volume work that I haven't read, but I know I need to read at some point.
What's that called?
Good question.
Yeah,
good question.
She's not familiar to me.
And she's earlier 20th century?
Yeah. No, well, and I think this is also the issue about women writers, right?
Yeah,
that they tend to get buried.
I quickly look it up.
Less so now, though. Dorothy Richardson.
Here we go. Pilgrimage, Pointed Roofs, The Tunnel, Backwater, Honeycomb, Interim. 13 semi-autobiographical novels published between 1915 and 1967. She was one of the earliest modernist novelists to use stream of consciousness as a narrative technique. Well, of course, there's Ducks Newburyport, isn't there,
Oh,
by
yes.
Lucy Ellman,
Yes.
which famously is 800 pages. I think, is it just one sentence? Or there's something about it. It doesn't have punctuation
She's
or
going
something.
Joyce one better, bless her.
I have a copy, and I did pick it up and sit down, fully intending to read it. And I read about 20 pages. I thought, this is brilliant. If I, a mother of 3 small children, was to try and write a novel, this is exactly the kind of novel I would write. It's just full of completely random little thoughts, but because it's her and I think she's rather brilliant, it's all very fascinating and everything resonates with you and sparks off ideas. So I can only imagine what the effect of reading the whole book would be. Anyway, I can't imagine anything nicer than sitting here and talking with you about long books. I only wish we had more time, but we don't want to try and do too long a podcast. So thank you, Toby. Thank you, Phil.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And hopefully
fun.
we can have another excuse to have a chat with you about other books sometime soon.
That's all for this episode. But first, a quick aside. Sharp-eared listeners, you may have wondered where I vanished to as we headed into our recommendations. I must confess, I had to slip off for a work meeting with my boss. But if I had been around, I would have heartily endorsed Kate's choice of Middlemarch by George Eliot. It's a book that everyone should read. You will love it. It's a long read that doesn't feel like a long read.
Books mentioned were A Little Life by Hanya Yanigahara, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, all 7 volumes of Proust, Ulysses by James Joyce, The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, Middlemarch by George Eliot, The Books of Jacob by Olga Tocarczuk, and Pilgrimage by Dorothy Richardson. For more on Toby's literary salon, you'll find all the details at litsalon.co.uk. This episode of the Book Club Review was produced and edited by me, Kate Slotover.
Our next episode is a long overdue bookshelf episode, where Kate and I will be catching up on the books we've each been reading outside of book club. Super excited about that one. We haven't recorded it yet, so we're really excited. But if you're looking for more bookish conversation right now, don't miss our last episode in which we talked new releases and upcoming titles to look forward to in the year ahead. Or discover 2 very different classics with us in episode 110. Those are Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner and The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. We won't spoil the plots, but we will tell you what we really thought.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. Do subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode. And if you like what we do, please do rate and review the show. It helps other listeners find us. If you want to go one better, please spread the word about us on your social media channels. Reaching new listeners makes us so happy. We treasure each and every one. Your support helps us to find them.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.